It was a quiet morning in the neighborhood when the incident occurred, a day like any other in the suburban community where people minded their business and went about their daily routines. But for Sarah, it was the beginning of an unusual chain of events. She had always prided herself on being a good neighbor, respectful and kind to everyone, even the most difficult ones, especially Karen, the HOA president, who had always rubbed her the wrong way. They had crossed paths several times in the past. But today would be different. Sarah had parked her car in her driveway, just like every other day, but as she stood at the front door sipping her coffee, she noticed Karen's car creeping toward her driveway. Out of the corner of her eye, she squinted, not sure if she was imagining it. But there it was, Karen's car parked right in front of her driveway, blocking her, and Sarah frowned, wondering what Karen was up to this time. Usually she had some odd reason for her actions, but this was something new. Blocking someone's driveway in broad daylight felt like a new low. Sarah couldn't help but shake her head as she walked outside and made her way toward Karen's car. She was already halfway across the yard when she noticed Karen step out of her house dressed as if she were on a mission. Sarah knew this was about to get complicated. Karen had always had a way of stirring up trouble in the neighborhood, and now Sarah was on the receiving end of it. She took a deep breath and approached the car slowly. As she reached it, Karen looked up from her phone, her eyes narrowing when she saw Sarah standing there. "What do you think you're doing?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Karen tilted her head and smirked as she responded, "I'm just making sure the driveway is clear. You don't need to be parking there anymore." Sarah stared at her in disbelief. This was ridiculous. She had lived here for years and had always parked in her driveway. Why was Karen suddenly taking issue with it? Karen let out a little chuckle, as if she knew something Sarah didn't. "Don't you know, Sarah, I'm the HOA president, and I've decided this is a no parking zone," she said in a condescending tone. Sarah blinked, stunned by the audacity of the claim. "No parking zone," she repeated, trying to process the words. She knew there were rules about parking, but her driveway had never been an issue before. "You're not allowed to park here anymore," Karen continued with a smug expression, as if she had all the authority in the world. "You'll have to find somewhere else to put your car." Sarah stood there for a moment in stunned silence, trying to gather her thoughts. She was already late for work, and dealing with this nonsense was the last thing she wanted. But Sarah had a reputation for standing up for herself, especially when it came to people trying to push her around, and Karen had just crossed the line. She wasn't going to let this go without a fight. She crossed her arms and stared at Karen. "How about you move your car out of my way first, and then we'll talk about this no parking zone nonsense." Karen didn't even flinch. Instead, she stood there glaring, as if daring Sarah to make the first move. But Sarah wasn't backing down. She was done with Karen's games. Karen didn't respond right away. Instead, she just stared at Sarah, her face growing more frustrated with every second. Sarah could feel the tension in the air. It was as if a storm was brewing, and Karen was about to unleash it. Sarah refused to give in. She wasn't about to let this woman dictate what she could or couldn't do with her own property. Karen finally broke the silence with a sharp laugh. "You really think you can tell me what to do?" she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "You're not going to win this battle." Sarah Karen had always been the type to believe she was in control of everything and everyone around her. She had the HOA president title, but that didn't mean she could break the rules without consequences. Sarah knew this wasn't just about parking. This was about power, control, and a deep-seated need for superiority. Karen was looking for an opportunity to flex her muscles, but Sarah was having none of it. "I don't know what game you think you're playing, but you're not getting away with this," Sarah said, her voice steady but filled with authority. She stepped closer to Karen's car, as if to make her point even more obvious. "This isn't your neighborhood to control, Karen, and I'm not going to let you bully me or anyone else into submission. You think you can just block my driveway without consequences?" "I don't think so." Sarah's words hung in the air like a challenge. Karen's eyes flickered with something between surprise and anger. She wasn't used to being spoken to like that, especially not by someone she thought of as beneath her in the hierarchy of the neighborhood. But Sarah wasn't intimidated. Karen took a deep breath, as if trying to gather her thoughts before responding. "Look, I'm doing this for everyone's good, Sarah," she said in a tone that was meant to sound reasonable, but came off as dismissive. "This whole area is a mess. People are parking in places They shouldn't, and causing traffic problems. You know the rules just like everyone else. You're the one who's out of line here." Sarah crossed her arms and shook her head, not buying it for a second. "You can't just make up rules on the spot to suit your needs, Karen. This is my driveway, I own it. And I have every right to park here. You can't just decide when and where people can park based on some personal vendetta you have against them," she said, growing more frustrated with each word. Karen's face twisted with irritation, as if she had heard enough. She was about to respond when a loud sound interrupted them both. A tow truck rumbled into the neighborhood, the engine roaring. As it slowed to a stop right next to Sarah's driveway, both women turned in surprise as the tow truck driver rolled down the window and looked at Sarah. "Hey, is this your car?" the driver asked casually. Sarah couldn't help but smile for a moment, realizing that she had a secret weapon. All along, she glanced at Karen, then back at the tow truck driver. "Yes, that's my car, and I need it moved," she said. Karen was now staring at Sarah in disbelief, her mouth slightly open, as if she couldn't believe what was happening. The power was shifting in real time, and Karen was beginning to realize that she wasn't in control. After all, Sarah leaned in toward Karen with a satisfied grin. "I told you, Karen, don't mess with the wrong neighbor. And I just so happen to own a tow truck business." Karen's eyes widened as Sarah spoke the words that would completely shatter her illusion of control. Sarah could see the shock in Karen's face as the tow truck driver waited for instructions. The situation had completely turned in her favor, and she wasn't about to let Karen back out now. Karen's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Her face was flushed with embarrassment and anger as she glanced between Sarah and the tow truck driver. She had no idea that Sarah had this hidden card up her sleeve. She thought she was dealing with an easy target. But now the tables had turned, and it was clear that she wasn't in control anymore. Sarah let out a deep breath and smiled to herself, feeling a sense of satisfaction wash over her. She wasn't just standing up for herself. She was also taking a stand for everyone else in the neighborhood who had been bullied by Karen's attitude for far too long. She looked over at the tow truck driver, who was now standing next to his truck waiting for the next step. He was clearly enjoying the spectacle as much as she was. "Yeah, it's my car," she said again to the driver. "You can go ahead and take it now, please." As the driver moved toward the car to prepare it for towing, Karen finally found her voice. "You can't be serious," she said, her tone incredulous. "This is a neighborhood. You can't just have your car towed like this. It's completely unreasonable." Sarah's smile widened. She was about to make Karen realize just how unreasonable she had been. "You think it's unreasonable to tow a car that's blocking my driveway?" she said, as she took a step closer to Karen. "No, Karen, it's unreasonable to think that you can control everyone's lives just because you hold some arbitrary title in the HOA. You've gone too far, and now you'll have to deal with the consequences." Sarah's voice was firm as she spoke. Her words were not just directed at Karen, but at everyone who had ever been intimidated by her manipulation. Karen's face turned bright red with fury. "You don't understand, you, Sarah," she said through clenched teeth. "This is about keeping the neighborhood in order, about making sure no one gets special treatment." Sarah's gaze never wavered as she met Karen's eyes. "I understand perfectly, Karen. I understand that you've been taking advantage of your position for far too long, and it ends now. You don't get to make rules for everyone else when you don't even follow them yourself." Karen's lip trembled as she struggled to come up with a response, but Sarah didn't give her the chance. The tow truck driver was already starting the engine to take the car away. Karen looked at the truck in horror as it slowly moved forward, her car now fully lifted off the ground and ready to be hauled away. "No, this can't be happening," she shouted, her voice cracking. But Sarah was done trying to reason with her. She had been more than patient with Karen over the years, and now it was time to end it. She turned to the tow truck driver. "Give her a receipt for the tow and let her know she can pick it up at the impound lot tomorrow," she said as she looked back at Karen, who was standing there seething with rage, unable to do anything but watch her car being taken away. Sarah took a step back and crossed her arms, feeling a sense of pride for finally standing up to the bully who had made her life miserable for so long. As the tow truck disappeared down the street, Sarah stood there for a moment, relishing in the victory, and knowing that she had just sent a clear message to Karen and anyone else who thought they could push her around. Karen stood in the middle of the street, her eyes burning with fury, her hands clenched into fists, As she watched her car disappear down the road, every fiber of her being screamed in anger. She couldn't believe what had just happened. How could Sarah do this to her? How could anyone defy her authority like this? She was the HOA president. She controlled everything in this neighborhood. Or at least she thought she did. Karen's breath was shallow and quick as she turned on her heels and marched back toward her house, her mind racing with thoughts of revenge. How dare Sarah humiliate her like that? How dare she stand up to her and get away with it? Karen wasn't the type of person to let things go. She would make sure that Sarah paid for this insult. She slammed the door to her house behind her and paced the living room furiously, her thoughts spinning around one thing after another. Sarah had crossed a line, and Karen wouldn't rest until she got her payback. But what could she do? How could she possibly make Sarah regret this? Karen was used to getting what she wanted, and now she was facing an enemy who wasn't afraid to stand up to her. Her mind worked in overdrive, trying to figure out a plan. She couldn't just let this slide. It would ruin her reputation as the person who kept everything in order around here. But she had to be careful. Sarah was not someone to be taken lightly. She was determined to find a way to make her life miserable. But Karen knew she couldn't go about it in the same old way. She would have to be strategic, more devious, something that Sarah wouldn't see coming. Karen took a deep breath as she sat down at her desk. In the corner of the room, she opened the drawer and pulled out a stack of papers from her most recent HOA meeting. They were full of complaints from other neighbors about parking issues, fences that were too high, lawns that were too unkempt. It was the kind of thing Karen lived for. Every little detail in the neighborhood had to be perfect, and anyone who didn't conform had to be dealt with firmly and swiftly. Her eyes narrowed as she began flipping through the papers, looking for a new way to get back at Sarah. There had to be something here, something she could use to turn the tables. She knew that Sarah wouldn't be caught off guard forever. Karen had a reputation for making people regret crossing her. But this time, she would have to be more careful. This time, she needed a real plan, one that would leave Sarah no room to fight back. She spent hours going through the papers, but nothing seemed to work. No obvious flaw to exploit, no rule to bend to her advantage. She felt a wave of frustration wash over her, but she refused to give up. She had to come up with something. After all, she wasn't going to let Sarah get away with making her look weak. It was just a matter of time before she found the perfect strategy, and when she did, Sarah would regret ever challenging her. Karen stood up from her desk with a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't over, not by a long shot, and she would make sure that Sarah understood just who was in charge around here. Karen would have her revenge. But first she needed to wait for the perfect moment, the one where Sarah wouldn't see her coming. The next day, Sarah woke up feeling lighter than she had in weeks. The whole situation with Karen had been exhausting, but now that her driveway was clear, she could finally breathe easy. She made herself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, glancing out the window at the empty space in front of her house. She smiled a little to herself. It felt good to have control back. It felt good to know that no one could just walk in and ruin her day anymore. But even as she enjoyed the calm of the morning, she knew this wouldn't be the end of it. Karen didn't give up that easily, and Sarah had a feeling she hadn't heard the last from her. She had been dealing with Karen's kind for too long to think that one victory would keep her quiet. Sarah had a good sense of when trouble was brewing, and everything about the way Karen had stormed off yesterday screamed that she was plotting something. Sarah was no stranger to confrontation, but she knew this time would be different. Karen wasn't going to just slink away in defeat. But Sarah wasn't about to back down either. She had already shown Karen that she wouldn't be bullied, and she wasn't going to let her turn her life upside down again. Sarah finished the coffee and walked outside to check on her car, making sure it was still parked properly. After everything that had happened, she wanted to make sure nothing else was out of place. She walked around it, inspecting it carefully. Nothing seemed off. Everything looked the same as it had the day before. But she still felt that nagging sense of unease. She couldn't shake the feeling that Karen was going to strike back soon. And when she did, Sarah had to be ready. As she stood there lost in thought, she heard a car pull up in front of her house. Sarah turned around and saw a familiar face. It was Dave from 2 houses down. He was waving at her with a big grin on his face. Sarah smiled back. Dave had always been a friendly guy, always ready to chat. Whenever he saw her, he parked his car in front of her driveway and got out. "Hey Sarah, how's it going?" he asked. Sarah smiled and waved back. "Good morning, Dave, not much, just enjoying the peace and quiet. Dave raised an eyebrow. That's a good change from the chaos I saw yesterday, he said with a chuckle. Sarah's smile faded slightly, and she nodded. Yeah, things got a little intense with Karen yesterday. But I think I made my point. Dave's expression shifted to one of concern. I only said, is she still giving you trouble? Sarah sighed and shrugged a little. I don't know what's going to happen next, but I'm ready for whatever she tries. Dave paused for a moment, and then leaned in a little closer. Look, Sarah, I don't want to alarm you, but I heard some things from a couple of the neighbors this morning. Apparently Karen's been telling people that she's going to make your life miserable. After what happened yesterday, she's been going on and on about how she's going to get back at you, he said in a low voice. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She had known Karen wouldn't take this lying down, but to hear it confirmed from someone else made the reality of the situation hit harder. Dave continued, I don't know how much of it is true or just Karen running her mouth, but you should probably watch your back. Sarah nodded slowly, already feeling the weight of what was coming. Karen wasn't going to stop until she had some kind of victory. And now Sarah was once again in the crosshairs of her obsessive need for control. Thanks for the heads up, Dave, she said, trying to keep her voice calm. I'll keep an eye out, but I'm not worried. Karen can't scare me away from my own home. Dave gave her a small smile. Well, I just wanted to make sure you were prepared for whatever comes next, he said. But if you need help, don't hesitate to reach out. Sarah appreciated the offer and nodded. Thanks, Dave. I'll let you know if I need anything. Sarah turned to walk back inside, but her mind was already racing. Karen wouldn't let this go. She had no doubt that something was coming, and she had to be ready for it. The days that followed felt like a waiting game. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Karen was watching her, that every corner she turned, there was something brewing just beyond her view. Every knock at the door made her heart race. For a split second she wondered if it was the HOA or someone else with another complaint. But every time it turned out to be nothing, just the ordinary distractions of suburban life. But Sarah knew better than to let her guard down. She knew Karen was planning something. But what was it? Sarah kept herself busy at home, keeping everything in perfect order. She wasn't about to give Karen any excuse to come after her. She avoided the mailbox for fear that Karen might have planted something in there. But after a few days, Sarah began to feel like maybe she was just overreacting. Maybe Karen had backed off. After all, Sarah had done what she needed to do. She'd stood up for herself in a way Karen hadn't expected. Maybe that was enough to shut her down. Maybe Karen had learned her lesson. Sarah told herself she could relax just a little. Maybe things would go back to normal. She had her peace and quiet again, and that was all she really wanted. But just as Sarah started to feel a sense of calm, she got a call that would change everything. It was from her tow truck business. A number she recognized immediately. She picked up the phone expecting a routine call, but what she heard made her stomach drop. Hey Sarah, it's Mark from the shop. We've got a problem with one of your trucks, he said, his voice tense. There's been an incident, and we need you to come down here right away. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. What happened? She asked, already worried. It wasn't good. There's been some damage to the truck. It looks like someone tried to mess with it, Mark explained. We don't know if it was deliberate or if it was just bad luck, but you need to get down here to see it for yourself. Sarah didn't hesitate. She grabbed her keys and rushed out the door. She could feel the unease crawling up her spine. As she drove to the shop, her mind racing. Could it have been Karen? Was this her way of getting back at her? She tried to push the thought out of her mind, but deep down, she had a sinking feeling that it wasn't just a coincidence. When Sarah arrived at the shop, she rushed over to her truck. Mark was standing next to it, his arms crossed with a serious expression on his face. The damage was clear. Someone had clearly tried to sabotage the vehicle. The tires were slashed, and there were scratches all over the sides of the truck. It looked like it had been attacked with a sharp object. Sarah's blood ran cold as she looked over the damage. This wasn't just an accident. This was personal. Someone had wanted to send a message. She stared at Mark for a moment, unable to find the words. She felt a growing anger bubbling up inside her, but she couldn't let it take over. Not yet. We've got security footage from the lot, Mark said, his voice low. I think you need to see it. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She nodded without saying anything and followed him inside to the back room. Mark pulled up the footage on a screen and rewound it to the time the damage had occurred. Sarah's eyes locked onto the footage, and she watched in disbelief as a familiar figure appeared on the screen. It was Karen. She was standing next to the truck, with a large knife in her hand slashing the tires and leaving deep marks on the side of the vehicle. Sarah's jaw dropped. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. It was like a punch to the gut. Karen had gone too far. Sarah's hands shook as she watched the footage play out on the screen. Karen's face was clear as day. The smug expression she had worn earlier in the week was now replaced with something darker, something full of hatred and malice. Sarah's stomach churned as the scene unfolded. Karen slashing the tires with vicious precision. It was no accident. It was deliberate. And it was meant to hurt Sarah. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to process what she was seeing. How could Karen go this far? How could she get so desperate and twisted over something as simple as parking in her own driveway? Sarah's thoughts were a blur. But one thing was clear: Karen had crossed a line. There was no going back from this now. Sarah could feel the anger rising within her. But she held it back. She needed to keep calm. She needed to think clearly. This wasn't just about her. It was about stopping Karen before she did something worse. Sarah turned to Mark, her voice low, but filled with intensity. She needs to be stopped, she said, her words sharp with determination. Mark nodded grimly. We can help you with this. We've got the footage and the evidence to back it up. But you need to decide what you want to do next. Sarah stood there for a moment, trying to gather her thoughts. What was the best course of action? Should she go straight to the police or handle this on her own? Part of her wanted to confront Karen right then and there, but she knew that could only escalate things. She wasn't dealing with a reasonable person. Karen had shown her true colors, and it was clear that she wasn't above breaking the law to get what she wanted. Sarah took a deep breath and turned back to Mark. Let's contact the authorities, she said, her voice steady but tinged with frustration. We'll show them the footage and file a report. We need to make sure Karen knows there are consequences for her actions. Mark gave a quick nod and pulled out his phone to start making the necessary calls. Sarah felt a strange sense of relief as she stood there watching him work. She wasn't going to let Karen get away with this. She wasn't going to let her terrorize her or anyone else in the neighborhood. Sarah could feel the wheels of justice slowly turning. She wasn't sure how long it would take to fix everything, but she knew she had done the right thing in speaking up. She had to stop Karen before she hurt anyone else. Sarah left the shop later that day with the knowledge that the wheels were in motion. She had taken the first step. Now it was time to wait and see what would happen next. But Sarah couldn't help the nagging feeling that Karen wouldn't go down without a fight, that this wouldn't be the end of it. She knew Karen too well to think that she'd simply back off. Karen had a way of turning any situation to her advantage, and Sarah had no doubt that she was already planning her next move. But Sarah was prepared. Now she had the evidence she needed, and she wasn't going to let Karen scare her anymore. Karen had tried to push her around and get away with it, but Sarah wasn't going to let her win. She was done being the victim, and now it was time for Karen to face the consequences. Sarah wasn't backing down this time, not ever again. The next few days were a blur for Sarah. As she waited for the authorities to take action, Karen had become eerily quiet, almost as if she were waiting for something to blow over. But Sarah knew better. She could feel it in her bones that Karen was planning something. She wasn't the type to go down without a fight. Sarah spent her days on high alert, constantly looking over her shoulder. Every time the doorbell rang, she tensed up, expecting Karen to show up on her doorstep, demanding a confrontation. But nothing came. It was as if Karen had disappeared from the neighborhood altogether. Sarah found herself second-guessing every little detail, wondering if she had missed something, if Karen had found a way to retaliate without leaving a trace. It wasn't until a week later that Sarah received a call that would finally shatter the quiet. It was the police officer who had been handling her case. They had managed to track down Karen's car and had located it parked in a public lot. But when they investigated further, they found something far worse than Sarah had expected. They had found multiple other cars that had been damaged with similar tire slashing and deep scratch marks, just like Sarah's. Sarah felt her stomach twist as the officer explained what they had uncovered. Karen hadn't just targeted Sarah. She had been going around the neighborhood and damaging people's cars on purpose. It was all part of her twisted vendetta against anyone who didn't obey her rules. And after what she had done to Sarah's truck, it was clear she wouldn't stop until someone made her face the consequences. The officer informed Sarah that they were going to bring Karen in for questioning, but they needed her to come down and provide her statement. Sarah agreed to meet with the police that afternoon, feeling a mix of relief and dread, knowing that Karen would soon have to answer for her actions. But as she hung up the phone, she couldn't shake the feeling that Karen would try to escape this somehow, that she would find a way to wiggle out of the consequences, as she always did. Sarah couldn't ignore the nagging thought that Karen had planned for this too, had anticipated the police getting involved, and was already one step ahead. Sarah had learned by now that Karen wasn't the type of person to just surrender easily. If anything, she would likely escalate things further to avoid facing the consequences. She had brought so much chaos into Sarah's life already, and now Sarah was starting to feel like the calm before the storm had come to an end. The longer she thought about it, the more the anxiety crept in. She had no idea what Karen's next move would be, but she was sure it was coming soon. That night, Sarah lay in bed staring up at the ceiling, unable to shake the tension that had settled in her chest. She thought about Karen, how everything had escalated from a simple parking issue to something far darker. Sarah had tried to be patient. She had tried to work things out with Karen. But now there was no denying that Karen's obsession had gone too far. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the police station to give her statement. She walked into the room with a sense of purpose, feeling the weight of the situation, but also the resolve to see it through. She wasn't going to let Karen get away with what she had done. But as she sat down with the officer, she was struck by something unexpected. A small part of her felt sympathy for Karen. She knew Karen's life wasn't perfect. She knew there had to be something driving this anger and obsession. But that didn't excuse her behavior. Sarah pushed the thought away quickly. It wasn't her responsibility to fix Karen's problems. She had her own life to take care of now, and Karen had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Sarah gave her statement with as much detail as she could, and the officer assured her they would be following up soon. She left the station feeling a little lighter but still on edge. She knew the next chapter in this fight was just beginning, and she wasn't sure how it would end. But one thing was certain: Karen was about to learn the hard way that no one could get away with terrorizing others forever. The days after Sarah gave her statement were tense and filled with uncertainty. Every time she left her house, she felt like someone was watching her. It was like Karen had become a ghost in the neighborhood, a presence she couldn't quite escape. And no matter how much Sarah tried to push the thought aside, she couldn't shake the feeling that Karen was planning something bigger, something more dangerous than she had ever done before. Sarah did her best to carry on with her life, but it wasn't easy. She couldn't stop looking over her shoulder. Every knock at the door made her heart race, and every car that passed her house felt like it was somehow connected to the looming threat of Karen. But Sarah wasn't one to back down. Not after everything that had happened. She wasn't going to let Karen control her life. Not now, not ever. But the silence only seemed to drag on for days, weeks. Even with no sign of Karen making a move, Sarah started to wonder if she was just being paranoid. Maybe Karen had truly backed off. Maybe the police were handling things just fine. But deep down, Sarah knew better. Karen didn't know how to back off. It wasn't in her nature. She had been cornered, and now she would lash out somehow when it came. Sarah least expected it. On the morning of the third week after giving her statement, Sarah received a call from Mark, the tow truck company owner. He sounded urgent, and she could tell something was wrong right away. "Sarah, I need you to come down here now," he said, his voice tight with concern. When she arrived at the shop, she found him waiting outside, his face serious, his usual easygoing attitude nowhere to be found. "What's going on?" Sarah asked, trying to stay calm. "It's Karen," Marks said, his voice low. "She's been here the lot twice this week. We think she's trying to steal one of your trucks." Sarah froze. The words didn't register at first. "What do you mean, steal one of my trucks?" she asked, her heart pounding. Mark looked around before leaning in closer. "We've been watching the trucks closely since everything started to happen, and we noticed she's been hanging around the lot at odd hours. Last night, she tried to get into one of the trucks and mess with the ignition." Sarah's stomach dropped. "What was she trying to do?" Sarah asked with disbelief. "I'm not sure, but we have security footage again." Mark said, "It's the same thing. She's trying to get into the vehicles, like she did with your truck. But this time we caught her on camera." Sarah could feel her body tense. She had to see the footage. He couldn't let Karen get away with this, no matter how twisted her reasoning was. Mark led her inside the small office and played the footage. Sarah's blood ran cold. As she watched the screen, Karen was there again, creeping through the lot, under the cover of night. She was moving with purpose, her eyes scanning each truck, as if searching for something specific. Then she was shown trying to break into one of Sarah's trucks, pulling at the door handle, trying to hotwire it. She looked as though she had done this before. Her movements were deliberate and careful. Sarah felt the anger surge through her veins. How far was Karen willing to go? What would she do next to try and take control again? Sarah looked at Mark, who was watching her carefully. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice shaking with frustration. Mark's face softened. "We need to report this again," he said. "But I'll also make sure we have everything locked down tight. From now on, we'll be watching everything closely." Sarah nodded. She knew he was right. The situation was escalating, and they had to stop Karen before she caused any more damage. Sarah knew this wasn't going to end quietly. Karen wasn't going to stop. Just because the police were involved, she was far too determined to maintain control. And her obsession with Sarah wasn't going away anytime soon. It was time for Sarah to be prepared for whatever Karen might throw at her next. She wasn't backing down. She couldn't. The next few days were a blur as Sarah focused all her energy on making sure her business and home were protected. She knew Karen wasn't going to give up so easily, and that meant she had to be vigilant at all times. Sarah spent hours at the shop, making sure the security system was updated and the trucks were locked down tight. She couldn't afford to be caught off guard again. The police had been informed about Karen's latest attempt to steal the truck, and they promised to step up their patrols around the neighborhood. But Sarah knew that wasn't enough. She couldn't rely on anyone else to handle it. She had to take matters into her own hands. Karen was unpredictable, and that made her dangerous. Sarah decided to take a more proactive approach. She started driving around the neighborhood at different times of the day, watching for anything unusual. She kept an eye on Karen's house, hoping to catch a glimpse of her or any sign of suspicious activity. Sarah knew it was a risk, but she felt like she had no other choice. As the days passed, Sarah's nerves began to wear thin. The constant tension was exhausting. She couldn't stop thinking about Karen. She couldn't shake the image of Karen lurking around the lot, trying to break into the truck. It was clear that Karen had no boundaries, no limits, and Sarah had to find a way to end this before it spiraled even further. Then one evening, as Sarah was heading home after a long day, she noticed something strange. She was pulling into her driveway when she saw a figure standing near her car, just a few feet away. At first, she thought it was a neighbor or someone walking by. But then the person turned, and Sarah's heart skipped a beat. It was Karen. She was standing there with her back to Sarah, seemingly unaware of her presence. Sarah's instinct was to confront her right then and there, but she stopped herself. She knew that wouldn't solve anything. If anything, it would only make things worse. Instead, Sarah parked her car slowly and quietly turned off the engine. She watched Karen for a moment, wondering what she was doing so close to her property. Karen was fiddling with something in her hands. Sarah's curiosity got the best of her, and she decided to get a closer look. She moved as silently as she could and approached from the side of the house. She didn't want to alert Karen to her presence, but she needed to know what she was up to. When she was close enough, she could see Karen had a small tool in her hand, a crowbar. She was trying to pry open the door of Sarah's tow trucks. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't believe it. Karen was at it again, trying to sabotage her business. Sarah's mind raced. She had to do something. She couldn't let Karen get away with it this time. Sarah made up her mind. She wasn't going to let fear control her. She wasn't going to let Karen ruin her life any longer. She grabbed her phone and quickly dialed 911. She whispered into the phone, describing the situation and telling them exactly where she was. Sarah hung up just as Karen turned around. Her eyes widened in shock when she saw Sarah standing there. But before she could react, Sarah stepped forward and demanded, "What do you think you're doing?" Karen just stood there for a moment, as if frozen. Then her face twisted into a sneer. "Don't act like you're the victim," she spat. Sarah's heart raced, but she stood her ground. "You've gone too far this time," Sarah said. "You've been terrorizing me and everyone around here long enough. It's over." Karen's expression shifted into something more dangerous. She backed away slowly. "It's not over," she said, her voice dripping with menace. Sarah knew right then and there this wasn't the last time she would see Karen. But this time Sarah was ready. She wouldn't back down. She wouldn't let Karen destroy her life any longer.